Dear Let's Brave New World, welcome you back to our second session of the day. Those of you who missed our earlier session today, Red Carpets and Other Banana Skins, Rupert Everett in conversation with Sandeep Roy, and all our other sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Oran Pamuk, Margaret Atwood, Edmund de Waal, and so many others. You can catch these on our Facebook page, JLF Lit Fest, or on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Lit Fest JLF. We welcome our magazine partner for this series, The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Our next session for the day is California Dreaming, Re-Imaging Silicon Valley, David C. Brock in conversation with Arun Mohan Sukumar. Silicon Valley has almost single-handedly shouldered the shift in our lifestyles, social, personal, or professional during the pandemic. David C. Brock speaks to writer and academic Arun Mohan Sukumar on big tech and Silicon Valley's history and culture of innovation. They will also discuss the paradox of how, although digital technologies have brought the world closer, the US is attempting to reduce the very immigration that was responsible for much of the creative stimulus to these industries. David C. Brock is a historian of technology and is the director of the Software History Center at the Computer History Museum. He is the co-author of Moore's Law, The Life of Gordon Moore, Silicon Valley's Quiet Revolutionary, and Makers of the Microchip, a documentary history of Fairchild Semiconductor. Arun Mohan Sukumar is a PhD candidate at the Fletcher School, Tufts University, and a junior fellow at the school's Center for International Law and Governance. He is the author of Midnight's Machine, A Political History of Technology in India. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section below. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Lit Fest JLF, or in the event that we drop off, just hang in there. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, California Dreaming, Re-Imaging Silicon Valley, David C. Brock in conversation with Arun Mohan Sukumar. Over to you guys.
Thanks, Sanjay. David, it's nice to meet you in person after all the emails that we've been exchanging.
Nice to meet you too.
And I think, what's ironical is that I think you are now in Massachusetts, while I am in San Francisco, whereas we should be switching places. The two cities that figure prominently in the history of technology in the United States and in the world. Thanks for joining us. This is a subject that, of course, is of great interest to me, but also increasingly to an Indian audience, which has engaged with the histories of technology quite recently. And some of it has to do with the fact that the popularization of technology, or computing in a mass way, has happened relatively recently. It took off immediately after the boom of the Y2K years, and since then has been on this exponential trajectory. And I wanted to ask you straight off the bat about the Computer History Museum and the work that you do at the Software History Center, given that it is, of course, one of the preeminent institutions of its kind in the world. And to the best of my knowledge, I can't think of a comparable institution in India. And given that there's so much happening in technology today, how do you go about cataloging its history? How do you select what turns up at the museum, what's exhibited, and the kind of stories that are told? So it'd be great to sort of get the discussion going by talking about the History Museum.
That's great. I love talking about the Computer History Museum. But first, let me just say, thanks to you for inviting me to participate. Thanks to the JLF for doing this whole online series. I think it's great, and I'm just so pleased to join. To answer maybe part of your question, how do we go about trying to preserve and interpret the history of computing when it's changing so rapidly and happening in so many places? I think the short answer for that is we just do what we can. As you probably know, there is internationally the community of people who are engaged with preserving and writing the history of computing broadly conceived is a pretty small community worldwide relative to the size of the story. 1,000, 2,000 people worldwide. So it's a pretty small community. And at the Computer History Museum, I think we are lucky enough to be able to try and preserve and build collections for that community to use, but also to use that collection ourselves to interface with a broader general public. And that's kind of a unique position for the museum to be in. And it is our ambition to engage with publics, certainly beyond Silicon Valley, beyond the United States, and really engage with people around the world who are interested in topics related to the history of computing. We now say that we take as our call, we want to decode technology for everyone. And we're trying to take that seriously. But a little bit about just the history of the Computer History Museum. It started out actually as an activity within a very prominent computer company, the Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC, headquartered in Eastern Massachusetts. That was the preeminent sort of firm in the mini computer era and was important beyond it. And one of the most notable computer architects at DEC, Gordon Bell, and his partner Gwen Bell and Gordon Bell continues to be very passionate about history, and could see a lot of the materials and a lot of the stories from the early generations of early generation of people involved in electronic computing were kind of in danger from a collecting standpoint. A lot of the early mainframe computers, which were in their nature sort of gigantic, were being scrapped. You know, there was no computer, there weren't museums of computing around. And so the Computer History Museum really started off as this activity within DEC, spearheaded by Gordon and Gwen Bell, to collect things, to collect the objects, and to collect the stories of the people involved with computing. They were very diligent and passionate, and the collection really grew. It first outgrew digital equipment and became a separate museum, then known as the Computer Museum. It was in Boston for many years in the 80s and 90s. At the end of the 90s, the institution was encountering some difficulties, maybe in part related to a sort of shift of where the center of action, maybe it's fair to say, was happening in the computer industry, shifting from Boston to the San Francisco Bay Area. And I suppose reflecting that, the museum essentially changed its nature somewhat, expanded its scope of its collection, was maybe focused a little bit more to history, and moved to Mountain View, California, due to the interest of a then Stanford computer science professor, Len Shustak, who is the chairman emeritus of the Computer History Museum, who really thought that it would be important to use history to teach computer science and computer literacy to students. And Len was at the time shocked that no such place existed, and dedicated a lot of his life and his effort to making it a reality. Now we're in Silicon Valley today. We have a large public facility in what turned out to be a popular neighborhood. After after we moved there, Google has moved into there. Its headquarters is down the street from us, and is of course expanded on that whole side of the Highway 101. And just around the corner from us is a site where Microsoft is busy at work building its big new Silicon Valley campus. So the museum feels right in the thick of it.
Yeah, I think the history museum is at risk of being taken over by the future.
Yeah, hopefully not. I feel like history is needed in the future.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. In fact,
I think we'll be okay.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure you'd be. In many respects, the Computer History Museum has been ahead of the curve in that many of the initial conversations that Gordon Bell and his collaborators had, I think can be dated back to the gradually from Boston and Route 128 to Silicon Valley, just as the action is. And even then, I think the Computer History Museum's establishment predates the creation of Google by a year or two, if I'm not mistaken, or just about the same time. And in the years that have followed, I think Silicon Valley has truly come into its own with the growth of the so-called FANG companies, Facebook, Apple, Google. You know, today they're known as big tech, and they're in the news every day and increasingly prominent in our day-to-day lives. What is the sense that you are getting? And of course, we can't get through this discussion without talking about the pandemic. But what is your sense of how? How the popular perception of Silicon Valley has changed, given that you would be having hundreds and thousands of visitors every month to the Computer History Museum, and you would also be getting a sense of what the popular attitude towards these companies have over the years and over the decades. And has it really changed, and do you expect it to change significantly after just as we are living through this pandemic?
That's a great question. It's been very interesting for me to see is, as a curator, to go down on the floor of the museum in our exhibits and see who's there. And one thing that really stood out is how many international visitors, that is to say, visitors not from the United States and not from the San Francisco Bay Area, we enjoyed. And I think and also when we look at the information about who's visiting our website and our other online resources, of which there are a lot, and we put an emphasis on, we also get, that is a very kind of global audience, but not maybe quite as global as the people who came in through the door. And I think what that represents is not only does the museum benefit from being in Mountain View, so kind of in the heart of Silicon Valley, it seems that the Computer History Museum has become a place where people who are internationally, globally, who are interested in Silicon Valley and what it means and what it's all about and what this whole story of technology is about, it's a place where they can come. So at one register, I think we see that international attention because people are interested in it, that they know that technology is in particular technology produced by some of these very recognizable customer facing firms is touching their lives every day. People around remember how I used to do it, and then wanting to know like what is behind that, how is that happening, and I hope an interest in who are the people behind it. So I don't think that, and on one register, like the interest in Silicon Valley, I think is perhaps greater than ever. But as I'm sure, well, from being in the Bay Area and through your work, Silicon Valley is by no means a monolith, either geographically, because now really Silicon Valley is like the whole Bay Area, It's this region with diverse communities that hold divergent beliefs and cultures, like any other region, really. But I do think it's safe to say that, particularly since the election of President Trump, most people in Silicon Valley perceive this kind of growing questioning about the benefits of digital technology. I think people perceive an increased focus on the negative aspects of the use of digital technologies.